Mia always thought of her life as a beautifully choreographed dance, though lately, it felt more like she was perpetually bracing for a trip. She viewed the world through a plural lens. There was no I in her vocabulary, only a persistent, dutiful we. When Julian was offered the position 3 states away, Mia didn't even look at the housing market for herself. She packed the boxes, labeled them in her neat cursive, and traded her promotion for a fresh start that benefited only one of them. "It's just an adjustment period," she'd tell her mother over the phone, ignoring the way her voice climbed an octave. "He's under a lot of pressure. I'm the only one who really knows how to handle him when he's like this." Handling him had become a full-time career. She was the architect of his reputation, the invisible hand that managed his social calendar and drafted the apologies he was too proud to give. When he snapped at a waiter or went cold for 3 days because she bought the wrong brand of coffee, Mia didn't see cruelty. She saw a sensitive soul who simply felt things more deeply than the rest of the world. She smoothed over his rough edges until her own palms were raw. One evening, as she was painstakingly organizing his closet by color, a task he hadn't asked for but would surely be angry if she neglected, Julian walked in and tossed his keys onto the dresser. He didn't look at her. "The Millers invited us to dinner Friday," he said, his tone flat. "I told them we're busy. I don't like the way that guy looks at you." Mia paused, a navy blazer clutched to her chest. The Millers were their only friends in the new city. "Oh, I thought we were looking forward to that." "Ben is just friendly, Jules. He's a distraction," he snapped, finally meeting her eyes. "I need you focused here." "Is that so much to ask after everything I do for us?" Mia felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a mix of guilt and a desperate need to fix the sudden chill in the room. She tucked the blazer into its place, the silk lining sliding against the rack with a soft hiss. She told herself his jealousy was just a fierce, protective kind of love. She told herself that being his everything was a compliment, not a cage. "Of course," she whispered, stepping toward him to straighten his collar. "We don't need them anyway." As she adjusted the fabric, she failed to notice that his hands didn't rise to meet her waist. She was so busy being the shield that she didn't realize the person she was protecting was the one holding the sword. In Mia's world, loyalty was the highest virtue, unaware that in Julian's hands, it was merely the whetstone he used to sharpen his control. If Julian was the storm, Zoe was the lighthouse. Whenever the walls of the house felt too narrow or Julian's silence grew too heavy to breathe through, Mia reached for her phone. Zoe always answered on the second ring, her voice a soothing balm that made the world feel right side up again. She was the younger sister who had blossomed into a woman of effortless grace, the kind of beauty that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. "He's just scared of losing you, Mia," Zoe would say, her voice honeyfic and reassuring during their long Sunday brunches. "You're the best thing that ever happened to him. You have to be patient." Mia watched her sister across the table, admiring the way Zoe's eyes crinkled when she smiled. Zoe had been there for every milestone and every meltdown. When Julian forgot their anniversary, it was Zoe who showed up with a bottle of wine and a bouquet, claiming she'd dropped a hint to Julian and wanted to make sure Mia felt celebrated regardless. She was always perfectly positioned on the sidelines, a constant, shimmering presence in the periphery of their lives. She was so helpful, so attentive. It was Zoe who suggested the specific shade of blue for the living room that Julian ended up loving, and Zoe who subtly mentioned that Mia should perhaps spend less time at the gym so she'd be home when Julian returned from work. "He misses you, honey," Zoe had whispered, squeezing Mia's hand. "He just doesn't know how to say it." At their last backyard barbecue, Mia watched Zoe laughing at one of Julian's dry, biting jokes, the kind that usually made Mia flinch. Zoe leaned in, her hand brushing his forearm for a second too long, her head tilted at that perfect, listening angle. Mia felt a surge of gratitude. Most people found Julian difficult, but Zoe truly understood him. She bridged the gaps Mia couldn't reach, translating his jagged edges into something Mia could manage to live with. "What would I do without you?" Mia asked later that night as they cleaned up the remains of the party. Zoe paused, a discarded wine glass in her hand, a reflection shimmering in the darkened window. "You'll never have to find out," she promised, her smile sweet and unwavering. Mia leaned into her sister's shoulder, missing the way Zoe's eyes drifted toward the hallway where Julian stood watching them. Mia saw a sister's devotion, a bond forged in blood and shared secrets. She didn't see the way Zoe curated the very chaos she then volunteered to calm. She didn't see that the lighthouse wasn't guiding her home, it was marking the spot where the ship would eventually break. Tuesday had no business being the day the world ended. It was a day of mundane rhythms, the hum of the dishwasher, the scent of lavender laundry detergent, and the steady rhythm of the rain against the bedroom window. Julian, whom Mia still occasionally called Daniel in the quiet, private spaces of her mind where his old self lived, had retreated into the bathroom, the hiss of the shower echoing through the suite. His phone sat on the nightstand, a sleek slab of glass and metal resting atop a book Mia had bought him but he'd never opened. When the screen ignited at 11:47 p.m., Mia didn't hesitate. They were after all. Their lives were an open book, or so she had convinced herself through years of curated loyalty. She reached for it, expecting a work notification or a news alert, her thumb hovering near the edge of the frame. The message preview was short, but it felt like a physical blow to her solar plexus. Still thinking about this afternoon, Tiger. Counting down until Friday. The nickname, Tiger, was a jagged blade. It was an intimate joke, something private and heated that didn't belong to the man who currently lived in her house. Below the text, a thumbnail of a photo loaded. It was a shot of a hotel vanity, draped in a discarded silk scarf Mia recognized instantly. It was the emerald green wrap she had gifted Zoe for her birthday last month. The cold didn't start in her hands, it started in her marrow. Her fingers moved with a terrifying, clinical detachment. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the device against the wall. Instead, she entered the passcode she'd known for years, the date of their first anniversary, and opened the thread. There was a history of them, a digital map of a betrayal so vast it made her dizzy. Timestamps from when she was at the grocery store. Photos taken in their own guest room while she was downstairs making dinner. The shower cut off. The sudden silence was deafening. Mia didn't move. With the steady hand of a surgeon, she took a series of screenshots and sent them to her own hidden folder, then deleted the evidence of her sent messages. She placed the phone back on the nightstand, precisely where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the book. When the bathroom door creaked open and Julian stepped out, smelling of steam and sandalwood, Mia was tucked under the duvet, her eyes closed, her breathing rhythmic and shallow. He leaned over and kissed her temple, his skin damp and warm. Usually, she would have turned into his touch, seeking the safety of his arms. Tonight, she remained still, a statue carved from ice. The girl who loved too much had died at 11:47 p.m. In her place, a stranger lay in the dark, watching the red light of the smoke detector blink like a heartbeat, waiting for the sun to rise so she could begin the slow, methodical work of burning it all down. The morning light was offensive in its brightness, casting long, sharp shadows across the breakfast nook where Mia sat with her coffee. To any observer, she was merely a wife enjoying a quiet start to the day, but beneath the surface, she was an archaeologist brushing the dust off a massive, buried deception. With Julian at the office and Zoe safely tucked away in her own apartment, Mia opened her laptop and began the excavation. She started with the digital trail, but it quickly bled into the physical world. She pulled out old planners and cross-referenced them with credit card statements she had once managed with pride. Every late night at the office, Julian had claimed over the last year now had a corresponding silent period in Zoe's text history. The weekend in October when Zoe had supposedly been down with a flu, the one where Mia had left a pot of homemade soup on her sister's porch without going inside to protect the baby, aligned perfectly with the 3 days Julian had spent at a leadership retreat in the city. The memories didn't just change, they curdled. She remembered the time she'd cried on Zoe's shoulder about Julian's growing distance, and how Zoe had held her tight, whispering that Mia was just overthinking things. Now, Mia could see the calculated flicker in her sister's eyes, the way those comforts weren't meant to heal her, but to sedate her. Zoe hadn't been a lighthouse, she had been the siren, singing Mia into the rocks while Julian held the tiller. The deeper she dug, the more the last 8 years felt like a movie where the audio was slightly out of sync. A birthday dinner where Julian and Zoe had shared a private laugh over a menu item. The way Zoe always knew Julian's favorite scotch before Mia could even ask. Every kindness from her sister now felt like a bribe, every quirk of Julian's felt like a calculated test of her endurance. By noon, the house felt like a crime scene. The very walls seemed to sweat with the weight of the things unsaid. Mia stood in the center of the kitchen, her hands trembling as the finality of it settled over her. She was standing at a horrific crossroads. To speak the truth was to trigger a demolition. She would lose the man she had built her world around and the sister who was her only remaining blood. The fallout would leave her standing in a wasteland of her own making. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened screen of her laptop, she saw a ghost. If she stayed, if she swallowed the poison and pretended the world was still whole, she wouldn't just be losing them. She would be complicit in her own erasure. The we she had defended so fiercely was a lie, and the I she was discovering was someone she barely recognized, someone who was tired of being the only one holding the ceiling up. Sunday dinner had always been the sacred center of Mia's world, but tonight, the dining room felt like a stage under a searing spotlight. She moved with practiced grace, setting out the linen napkins and the heavy silver, her movements a masterpiece of muscle memory. Across from her, Zoe was laughing, the sound like shattered glass against Mia's ears. Julian sat at the head of the table, radiating the calm of a man who believed he was untouchable. For 14 days, Mia had lived in the hollowed-out shell of her former life. She watched them with a clinical, detached fascination. She noticed the way Zoe's foot occasionally strayed toward Julian's side of the table, and how Julian's eyes lingered on the doorway whenever Zoe left the room. The quirks she once excused as stress were now revealed as the restless energy of a man keeping a secret. The sisterly advice Zoe offered, "You look tired, Mia, maybe you should take a solo weekend away," was no longer a gesture of care, but a tactical maneuver to clear the field. The psychological toll was a heavy, constant pressure behind her eyes, but it was also a strange kind of fuel. In the silence of her own mind, Mia was no longer a victim, she was an architect. Every time she laughed at Julian's jokes or squeezed Zoe's hand, she felt a cold thrill of power. They thought she was the same Mia, the girl who loved too much, the one who would sacrifice herself to keep the peace. They had no idea that the girl they knew had been buried under the weight of that 11:47 p.m. timestamp. "Is the chicken okay, Mia?" "You've barely touched yours," Zoe said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness that used to make Mia feel safe. "It's perfect," Mia replied, forcing a smile that reached her eyes but stopped short of her heart. "I'm just savoring it. You know how I hate for good things to end too quickly." She looked from her sister to the man she had moved across the country for, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a sharp, crystalline clarity. She wasn't just waiting for the right moment to leave, she was waiting for the right moment to strike. She realized then that justice wasn't just about walking away, it was about ensuring they understood exactly what they had destroyed. As she raised her wine glass, catching the reflection of her own steady, unwavering gaze in the crystal, Mia felt the final vestige of her passivity wither away. She was playing the role of a lifetime, and the finale was going to be spectacular. She had spent years managing Julian's reputation and Zoe's happiness. Now, she would manage their downfall. The meeting with Marcus happened in the corner of a dimly lit library, a place so far removed from Julian's curated social circles that Mia felt she could finally breathe without checking for hidden meanings. It had been 3 years since she'd spoken to him. Julian had once called Marcus unsettlingly intense, a subtle critique that had been enough for Mia to slowly sever the ties of a 20-year friendship. Now, looking into Marcus's steady, honest eyes, she realized Julian hadn't found him intense, he'd found him observant. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the building, Mia," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the performative pity she'd grown used to from Zoe. When she told him, not the whole story, but enough, he didn't look shocked. He didn't offer a platitude about working it out, or misunderstandings. He simply leaned forward and placed a hand on the table, not touching hers, but anchoring her nonetheless. "I never liked the way he partitioned your life," Marcus said quietly. "And Zoe. Zoe has a habit of making sure she's the only person you can turn to. I saw it back in college. I just didn't know how to tell you without sounding like the jealous friend he wanted me to be." For the first time in years, Mia didn't have to explain herself. Marcus didn't need her to manage his ego or smooth over his rough edges. He was a mountain, unmoving and sure. Over the next few days, he became the silent engine behind her plan. While she played the doting partner at home, Marcus helped her navigate the logistics she had ignored for years. He helped her find the bank accounts Julian had moved to, simplified joint holdings, and tracked down the lease agreements for the secret apartment Zoe had rented 2 months prior. The contrast was staggering. Julian's loyalty was a debt she was constantly paying off. Zoe's was a drug that kept her sedated. But Marcus's loyalty was a quiet, sturdy bridge. He didn't ask for her gratitude or her dependence. He simply stood in the gap she had left when she decided to stop being a we and start being an I. "We're not looking for revenge, Mia," Marcus reminded her one evening as they pored over a folder of evidence. "Revenge is emotional. We're looking for the truth. You need a foundation of facts so that when you walk away, they can't gaslight you into thinking you imagined the fire." As she watched him work, Mia felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a decade: safety. Not the fragile safety of a house of cards, but the ironclad security of being seen for exactly who she was. She had lived so long on counterfeit love that the real thing felt like a new language. Marcus wasn't just helping her leave, he was helping her remember that she was a person worth protecting. Together, they weren't just gathering evidence, they were performing a quiet, necessary archaeology of her own worth. The annual spring gala for her father's foundation was the perfect stage, a room draped in white silk and filled with the soft, upper-crust hum of the people who defined Mia's world. Her parents stood at the center, beaming with a pride that Mia knew was about to become collateral damage. Julian looked striking in his tuxedo, his hand resting possessively on the small of Mia's back, while Zoe stood beside them in a shimmering gold gown, playing the part of the devoted, radiant sister. Mia felt a strange, cold peace. The anger had burned off days ago, leaving behind something far more dangerous, a vacuum of emotion. She waited until the champagne toast had ended and the inner circle had gathered in a quiet alcove for a private moment. "I have a gift for the two people who have been so instrumental in my life this year," Mia said, her voice cutting through the air like a silver bell. She didn't wait for a response. With a steady hand, she reached into her clutch and pulled out a stack of high-resolution prints, the screenshots of the 11:47 p.m. messages, the hotel receipts, and the photo of Zoe's green scarf draped over a chair that wasn't hers. She fanned them out across the mahogany table like a hand of cards. The silence that followed was visceral. Her mother's gasp was a sharp intake of breath that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. Julian's face went a sickly shade of grey, the mask of the sensitive soul cracking in real time. Zoe's hand flew to her throat, her eyes darting toward the exit, the lighthouse finally going dark. Julian started to speak, his voice trembling with the first notes of a practiced defense. "Mia, sweetheart, you don't understand, this is out of context." "Don't," Mia said. It wasn't a shout, it was a command. She looked from Julian's hollow eyes to Zoe's trembling lips. She felt the shift in the room, the way her parents recoiled from the two of them as if they were suddenly contagious. The we she had spent 8 years protecting disintegrated into a million jagged pieces, and for the first time, she didn't try to catch them. She leaned in, her gaze level and terrifyingly calm. She didn't need a monologue. She didn't need to cry for their benefit. She simply let the weight of her preparation settle over them like a shroud. "I am no longer your best-kept secret," she said, her voice unwavering. The power in the room didn't just shift, it crystallized around her. As she turned to walk away, leaving them to drown in the truth she had so meticulously curated, Mia realized she wasn't just leaving a relationship. She was stepping out of the shadows of other people's needs. The archaeology was over. The reconstruction had begun. The room remained trapped in a suffocating stasis, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the metallic tang of ruin. Julian's attempts at a defense were a frantic, graceless scramble. He tried to pivot to his old standby, the narrative of his own fragility, muttering about how Mia's emotional distance had driven him into a moment of weakness. But as his words hit the cold, hard evidence on the table, they sounded like what they were, the desperate gasps of a man whose armor had been stripped away. Then Zoe spoke, and the mask didn't just slip, it shattered into something jagged and ugly. There were no tears of repentance. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of simmering, long-held resentment. "You always had everything, Mia," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "The perfect career, the perfect poise, the perfect little life. I didn't take him because I wanted him, I took him because he was the only thing you had that I could actually touch." The revelation was a second earthquake, one that fractured the family along fault lines Mia hadn't known existed. Her father's silence was a roar of disappointment, his gaze fixed on Zoe as if she were a stranger. Her mother, who had spent decades fostering the image of the perfect sisters, sat down heavily, her face aged by 10 years in 10 seconds. The social standing they had all meticulously cultivated evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. Everyone in the alcove seemed to be disintegrating, losing their shape in the face of the truth. Julian looked small, his charisma replaced by a pathetic, cowering vanity. Zoe looked hollowed out by her own bitterness. Even her parents were bent by the weight of the scandal. In the center of the wreckage stood Mia. She felt a strange, detached lightness. She had expected to feel a crushing grief, desire to collapse or scream, but instead, she felt a profound sense of structural integrity. For 8 years, she had been the glue holding everyone else's lies together. Now that she had let go, she was the only thing that wasn't breaking. She didn't stay to watch them try to piece the shards back together. She didn't need to hear the rest of their justifications or witness the slow, agonizing social reckoning that would follow as the news rippled through the gala. She simply picked up her clutch, nodded once to her parents, a gesture of final, tragic respect, and walked toward the exit. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she didn't look back at the golden lights of the ballroom. She felt that she had once clung to falling away like dead skin. The fallout was seismic, yes, but she was no longer part of the landscape being leveled. She was the architect who had walked off the site just before the controlled demolition, finally ready to build something on ground that was entirely her own. 6 months later, the morning air in the city smelled of rain and possibilities, a sharp departure from the stagnant humidity of her old life. Mia sat in her new office, a space of clean lines, tall windows, and an atmosphere she didn't have to curate for anyone else's comfort. The consulting firm she had quietly mapped out during those 2 weeks of strategic silence was no longer a frantic escape plan, it was a thriving reality. She had used the very skills she once squandered on Julian, the reputation management, the logistical precision, the ability to see 5 steps ahead, to build a foundation that belonged solely to her. She wasn't just surviving, she was expanding. On the corner of her desk, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from Marcus, a simple photo of a bookstore window they had discussed visiting later. There was no pressure in his attention, no hidden tax on her time. Being with Marcus didn't feel like a performance or a negotiation. For the first time, Mia understood what it felt like to be chosen for her strength rather than tolerated for her usefulness. He was a steady presence in the room she was building, a man who didn't need her to be smaller so he could feel large. Her parents still called twice a week, their voices tentative and heavy with the debris of the family's fracture. They were still processing the loss of the daughter they thought they knew, struggling to reconcile the Zoe they loved with the person who had held the match to Mia's life. Zoe herself had reached out 3 times. The first message was an apology that sounded like a demand, the second was a plea, the third was a jagged burst of blame. Mia hadn't replied. It wasn't a silence born of burning hatred or a desire for a dramatic finale. It was simply that the girl who would have rushed to bridge that gap, to smooth over the misunderstanding, no longer existed. Mia finally understood that healing wasn't about slamming doors in a fit of pique, it was about moving into a house where those old keys no longer fit the locks. She didn't hate Zoe, but she no longer recognized her as a necessity. As she looked out over the skyline, Mia felt the weight of the last year settle into a solid, impenetrable core. The betrayal had been intended to break her, to keep her small and compliant, but it had accidentally acted as a forge. It had burned away the plural we, and left behind a singular, resilient I. The woman who had arrived at that gala in a white dress had been a ghost of someone else's expectations. The woman sitting in this office was something entirely different. She was the architect of her own peace, a woman built from the rubble, and she was, at last, unbreakable.